Welcome everyone and Happy New Year! This is the first episode of 2021 and as such I've decided to try something different. A couple of you fine folks, including I believe one of my patrons, the artist Setken, expressed interest in me divulging more of the story of Egyptian Stele 666 and the founding of one of the first Egyptian revival religious movements of the modern era, the temple or sometimes church of Thelema. So I'm pleased to say that's the story I'll be exploring today. This is a new format that I'm experimenting with. I'm hoping to do more, though I found that they do take substantially longer to write and record. So if they're popular enough, I'll look into ways to do more of them in the future, but do expect more interviews incoming. Crowley is a figure who looms large in my youth. In my earliest explorations of magic, and in particular Egyptian magic, he's the figure that most folk pointed me towards. Now, back then, and this is the early 90s, so I'm giving away my age here, there was no real internet to speak of. Just imagine that, kids. No internet. So knowledge was traded through conversation and books. It was a very different, somewhat piecemeal approach to discovering a new subject, where generally the effort outweighed the rewards. Through my various readings in paganism, ceremonial magic, and Egyptian esoterica, I stumbled upon the Book of the Law and Thelema, and took an interest in both, though I was never a member or practitioner thereof. This episode is kind of a summation of things I learned back then, and I hope you find it as fascinating as I do. Before we begin, a note on pronunciation. I'd always, it seems, wrongly assumed it was pronounced Crowley, like Owly, but I recently came across a few items online that suggest his name was pronounced Crowley like Holy. And indeed, he was said to remark, "It's Crowley like Holy, not Crowley like Fowley," which seems a little out of character maybe, but I'm just going with the latest evidence I can find. Likewise, I'm going with the Greek pronunciation of Thelema, so I hope that doesn't bother anyone. Also, much of Crowley's life is shrouded in myth, conflicting accounts, even from the man himself, so forgive me if the details are sometimes sketchy or if I offer up some variations here and there. It's just the nature of the beast, so to speak. This is the story of how the so-called wickedest man in the world started a movement some consider a religion in the early 20th century. It was based on ancient Egyptian gods in a book dictated by a holy spirit, or so it was claimed. It was a book that would confound readers for decades, inspire volumes of study despite strict guidance against such practice, and even some claim predicted a century of war, which would be proven correct by the two biggest conflicts the world had ever seen. This is the story of Aleister Crowley, Stele 666, an Egyptian priest called Ankh Khonsu, and the Aeon of Horus. This is the story of the Book of the Law. Aleister, or Edward Alexander Crowley, was born to wealth in Leamington Spa, Warwickshire on the 12th of October 1875. He received his education at Trinity College, Cambridge, beginning with philosophy and eventually transferring to English literature. He spent much of his time focused on chess and poetry and, one of the more adventurous hobbies of the era, mountaineering, which was popular amongst the leisure classes given as it was to exotic travel and tales of daring do. Rejecting his family's Christian fundamentalist ties, Crowley became increasingly involved in forms of both Eastern and Western esotericism. A frequent traveller, he'd become involved in Hindu yoga, amongst other, what was once called Orientalist, spirituality. But it was his meeting with fellow alchemy enthusiast, the chemist Julian Baker, and his later introduction to Samuel Liddon MacGregor Mathers that would influence his next and likely most famous work in Western esoterica. Mathers was a founding figure in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. For those unfamiliar with the group, they were a society of magicians formed in 1887 by mostly Freemasons. They were interested in the pursuit of Hermetic Kabbalah, tarot, alchemy, and related phenomena. As such, this was an esoteric or occult magic not to be confused with stage or, quote, fake magic, although there were certainly crossovers in both practices and social worlds between the two. It's of note that the Golden Dawn at the time of Crowley's joining had been rather influenced by Florence Farr. Farr was an actress and playwright of some note, a notable first-wave feminist and enthusiastic Egyptologist. She was the author of a book on Egyptian magic and two Egyptian-themed plays. Farr was the subject of the romantic attentions of both George Bernard Shaw and later William Butler Yeats, the latter of whom was also an established member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Now, whilst I don't want to stray too far into this territory, because Farr deserves and will be getting her own episode at some point, it's hard to overstate Farr's influence on the practices of the Golden Dawn, and it's said that there was little authentic Egyptian material actually included in their practices before Farr's arrival. Florence Farr became the praemonstratrix of the Isis Urania, a role which basically put her in charge of aspects of teaching and syllabus. She later rose to replace another Golden Dawn founder, William Westcott, and became chief adept in Anglia and the leader of the English lodges. She additionally became the official representative of the founder MacGregor Mathers, the only remaining founder who by this time resided in Paris. Why is this relevant? Well, there was eventually a schism shortly after Crowley joined, and Mathers and Crowley sided in an effort to regain control from British adepts who had more or less revolted against Mathers' remote rule. Farr had resigned as leader of the lodges at this time, but her influence had already played its part, and it's fair to say that Crowley would have been exposed to at least a smattering of Egyptian-influenced esoterica whilst at the Golden Dawn. There was an infamous incident around this time called the Battle of Blythe Road, which has been occasionally portrayed as a pitched battle between black and white magicians, Crowley on the one hand and Yeats on the other. But these stories are often overblown, and it appears closer to the truth that Crowley, under Mathers' urging, had entered the Golden Dawn sanctum on Blythe Road, which is now located above a cafe by the way, and attempted to seize their documents. Given that he was not listed as one of the paying tenants, the police were called to the scene by the legal occupiers of the Golden Dawn, and they ousted Crowley. Eventually the courts ruled against Crowley and Mathers' claim on these contested materials, and the rest, as they say, is history. Crowley left the Golden Dawn and returned to a life of travel, purportedly joining the Freemasons whilst in Mexico City and travelling through India and the Far East. It was at the end of this period that Crowley met Sir Gerald Kelly, his future brother-in-law, and later married one Rose Edith Kelly. Rose had been recently widowed, and her marriage to Crowley was said to be one of convenience to help her escape an arranged marriage. But the couple appear to have developed a close relationship and travelled for their honeymoon to Cairo, Egypt in 1904. And here is where the story of Thelema can truly be said to begin. Rose was allegedly completely disinterested in magic, which certainly works to make Crowley's account of this story more intriguing, though it should be remembered that this is an account, and the details are muddy and sometimes contradictory. According to Crowley, on March 16, 1904, the couple stayed overnight in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Now, this is hard to imagine now, but with enough money and influence, you can certainly access places outside regular hours. Never one to miss an opportunity, Crowley is partaking in a ritual called the Bornless Ritual, supposedly to impress Rose with manifestations of spirits known as sylphs or elementals. Rose purportedly sees nothing, but becomes entranced, uttering repeatedly, "They're waiting for you." Crowley is bemused. Who's waiting for me? In his accounts, he's initially dismissive. As to Crowley's mind, what does she know of magic after all? 2 days later, on the 18th, he invokes Thoth, sometimes called Tahuti, the Egyptian god of writing, knowledge, and sometimes magic. It's after this that Rose's trances become more specific. She finally identifies the deity as Horus. Horus is waiting for you. More specifically, an emissary of Horus named Aiwas. We'll come back to this. The Egyptian god Horus was the son of Isis, a major figure in the Golden Dawn and Western magical traditions, and he was best known at this point in history through the tale of avenging his father Osiris against the usurper, his uncle Set, as these are the tales that had been passed down from classical Greece and would have been familiar to many with a classical education. Crowley, however, isn't convinced that Rose knows who Horus is, so he decides to test her. He asks Rose a series of questions on the nature of Horus. Looking back at them now, most of which are more to do with the magical associations that Hermetic magicians might have made. But to Crowley's apparent surprise, she answers every single one correctly. In some versions of the tale, Crowley claims that there was no possible way she could have known these answers, never having studied Egyptian myth or deities. In another version of the tale, however, Crowley had performed a rite dedicated to Horus some days before, which muddies the notion of Rose's unfamiliarity somewhat. Taking a trip to the nearby Egyptian museum, he asks her to point out Horus. He purportedly scoffs as she passes row after row of images containing Horus, not stopping for a single one. It's only when she reaches a particular image, that of Ra Harakti, does she stop and point at the deity. Crowley is astounded. Not only has she pointed out the god, in a composite war form, but the original label for the stele, the label which was used as its previous housing number at the Bulak Museum, reads 666. The number of the beast, and a magical number Crowley had chosen for himself some time previously. The stele of Ankh of Khonsu. What is this stele? Well, a stele is an offering tablet that's typically shaped like a modern gravestone, rectangular with a curved top. This stele was discovered by Auguste Mariette, the French Egyptologist who helped found the Egyptian Department of Antiquities. It was discovered in the mortuary temple of the female pharaoh Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri in 1858. The stele itself is nothing particularly unusual, as far as museum collections go, though it's very well preserved. It's an offering stele from around the 25th dynasty or 3rd intermediate period, which in plain English means it's from around the mid-7th century BC. It's made from wood, covered in painted plaster, measuring at around 50 centimetres high by 30 wide. It was created for a priest named Ankh Khonsu, and depicts the priest making offerings to a falcon-headed god who is Ra-Haraxi, a composite form of the gods Horus and Ra. The Egyptians did this often to combine or enhance specific qualities of deities. In this instance, it emphasises the solar aspects of both Ra and Horus of the horizon, which Geraldine Pinch says was the triumphant sun who rose in the east as ruler. It is a deity at the zenith of his powers. Ankh Khonsu was a priest of the god Montu, another falcon-headed deity who was associated with war and valour, and very popular at Thebes in this period. Curiously, there's a small statue attributed to Ankh Khonsu at Macclesfield Museum, which garners visitors from far and wide, presumably because of his fame through the Church of Thelema. More on that later. But back to the stele. Nut, the goddess of the sky or cosmos, spans the top of the offering scene with a winged solar disk known as Bedhekti just beneath her. The stele is also covered in hieroglyphic script, which are chapters from the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead is typically thought to only contain instructions for the deceased to pass the tests of the underworld, and that's the context in which examples have been found, although there are interpretations which imply that it may have also been used for spells or rites by the living. Your mileage may vary. Translations of the script can be found online. There's a wrinkle here I just wanted to pull out. I'd always understood that the couple visited the Bulak Museum, and indeed that is what Crowley claims in some sources. However, there's an aberration in chronology here. The Bulak Museum is said to have been flooded in 1891, and collections were moved to a former royal palace in Giza. The Bulak closed around 1901 or 1902 at the latest, which makes it impossible for Crowley to have visited with Rose 2 years later in 1904. Now, there are likely explanations. Perhaps they went to the Egyptian Museum and it was still colloquially known as the Bulak, which seems, I think, at least plausible, and how the confusion may have arisen. Either way, it's a detail that seems to be brushed over a lot, and as an Egyptologist, I wanted to pull it out for due diligence. It's Crowley's interpretation of the stele and what happened next that paints an intriguing picture. After the tests and the museum trip, Crowley attempts an invocation of Horus, which is met with quote-unquote great success, and he has the hieroglyphs on the stele translated in short order. This was apparently originally undertaken by the assistant curator of the Bulak Museum. Again, perhaps they were transferred to the new site at this stage. And later, Crowley has a second translation undertaken, ostensibly by two giants of the Egyptological world, Sir Alan Gardiner himself and Batiscombe Gunn. Now, the reference to Gunn I've seen crop up in multiple times over the years and seems to hold water. To me, this only emphasises how small these worlds and the Victorian elite really were, given that Florence Farr had been working with and rubbing shoulders with these Egyptologists for many years, while simultaneously researching and writing on Egyptian magic and working with Yeats and the like at the Golden Dawn. Back to our story though. On the 7th of April 1904, Rose lays out the instructions for Crowley. That he is to enter the temple, that's to say the drawing room of his rented apartment near the Bulak Museum site, for 3 days and hear the communication from the entity, Aiwas, whom Rose identifies as the messenger of Horus. And so it came to pass that between noon and 1 p.m. for 3 days, from the 8th to the 10th of April 1904, Crowley sat at his desk in the drawing room and awaited the messenger. He describes a voice coming from his left shoulder at the corner of the room. Describing the voice in the Equinox of the Gods, he notes it was of deep timbre, musical and expressive, its tone solemn, voluptuous, tender, fierce, or aught else as suited to the moods of the message. Crowley also notes of his impression of the appearance of this divine messenger, and that he was a tall, dark man in his 30s, with a body composed of fine matter, like gauze. He was well-knit, active and strong, with the face of a savage king. His eyes vowed, lest they destroy what they saw. And so it was for 3 days that he sat and he wrote. He wrote of ancient kingdoms. He wrote of every man and woman being a star, that is, divine. Each day he produced a chapter, each mysterious, opaque, shrouded in symbolism, until the last, which Crowley would later call gratuitously atrocious. The book, comprised of these 3 chapters, has 3 narrators. The first is Nut, or Nut, the Lady of Starry Heaven, in Crowley's words, who is traditionally the Egyptian goddess of the night sky and mother of Isis and Osiris. The second narrator is named Hadit, and is taken to be a form of Horus of Bedet, the winged solar disk seen on the Stele itself. This deity is the fire at the source of the star, an infinitely condensed point which acts as a counterpoint and complement to Nut, who is expansive space. Hadit is therefore the centre of her infinite circumference. Now, I don't want to go too far into the metaphysical, but in Crowley's terms, it's the marriage of these 2 principles that brings the fruitful tension of creation and perhaps in some interpretations, higher forms of consciousness. The third and final chapter is presented by Ra-Hor-Khut, Crowley's version of Horus the Child, or Hor-Pakrat or Hippocrates by the Greeks. This chapter is perhaps the most violent and shocking in its imagery, particularly when compared to the first. But what did it all mean? For the most part, it was interpreted as a prophecy, and Crowley himself the prophet of a new age. This was to be the Aeon of Horus, the crowned and conquering king. It would differ from previous aeons in its championing of the individual, but would also be marked by war. The prior aeons, according to Crowley and later writers, were characterized by Isis and later Osiris. The first begins with the mother goddess and highlighted the sacred feminine nature of the divine. We can actually see traces of this in the archaeological record, particularly from Upper Paleolithic Europe and Eurasia, commonly dating to around 20,000 years ago. This evidence takes the form of mother goddess figurines, often headless, nude female statuettes with enlarged hips and breasts. The oldest, called the Venus of Holfels, is carved from mammoth tusk. You heard that right, and possibly dates back as far as 35,000 years ago. So the age of Isis is interpreted by Crowley as the divine feminine that dates back into prehistory and was eventually replaced by the second Aeon, the age of the dying and reborn king. This era is characterized by deities such as Osiris, whose death, mummification, and subsequent resurrection can be seen to resonate down through different belief systems, particularly those of the Bronze and Iron Ages. These figures are often redeemers who are sacrificed and can be found across multiple religions and beliefs such as Mithraism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Odinism, and many more. Osiris and tributes to him can be found as far back as the 5th dynasty of Egypt around 2500 BC, but his name and attributions imply an earlier origin to his myth and worship to at least the 5th dynasty of Egypt. I'm going to note here that the myth of Osiris, which I will be covering in future episodes, is crucial to many of the core Egyptian beliefs and reflects and influences agriculture, burial practices, conceptions of the afterlife, and royal succession. That's to say, rightful kingship, a concept we see demonstrated very clearly in the war between his son Horus the Youth and his brother Set, who murdered Osiris and usurped his throne, particularly in later and Greco-Roman interpretations of the myth. Crowley saw the 19th century as the dawn of a new Aeon, the Aeon of the crowned and conquering child Horus. In the Confessions of Aleister Crowley, he states that Aiwas, uttering the word Thelema with all its implications, destroys completely the formula of the dying god. Thelema implies not merely a new religion, but a new cosmology, a new philosophy, a new ethics. This Aeon was to be marked by growth, moral independence, a society released from its obsession with fear and conscientiousness of sin. It will be absurdly sensitive to pain and suffer from meaningless terror. It will be conscienceless, cruel, helpless, affectionate and ambitious. And Crowley goes on to note that much which characterises childishness will also characterise the new era. Many commentators have pointed to the Book of the Law as having predicted not only the Great War, but a century marked by 2 world wars, previously unknown to humanity. It prophesies the ongoing conflicts of the 20th century, marked by mankind's adoption of new and terrifyingly powerful technologies, which, if we're honest, we haven't always handled maturely as a species. Crowley is said to have then put the work aside for some time, unsure what to do about it. Having sent out a few typescripts to fellow occultists, he returns to poetry, publishing, travel, and engaged in mountain climbing and big game hunting. Rose gave birth to their daughter, Lilith, and Crowley continued to experiment with magic, sex, drugs, and adventuring. However, in Shanghai, he performs a ritual with a friend in an attempt to contact the entity Aiwas, and he claims to have been contacted by this entity on subsequent occasions to write additional texts, though these never attained the same notoriety. Eventually, he constructs a kind of successor for the now disbanded Golden Dawn, forming an order called the AA, short for Argentum Astrum, Latin for Silver Star. This is where he takes on students and begins to espouse the teachings of the Book of the Law, in addition to numerous other systems. He also joins and eventually assumes leadership duties at the Ordo Templari Orientis, aka the OTO, another occult initiatory system where he begins to espouse the ideas in his Book of the Law. This is all to say that we can see the origins of the later organisation of Thelema in these movements. But it wasn't until 1920, when the British press had been gunning for Crowley for many years and calling for his head, and a number of libel lawsuits, many unsuccessful for Crowley, that he would decide to pack up shop and head for quieter accommodations. This found him moving to the Sicilian town of Cefalù, where he would found the Abbey of Thelema. So what is Thelema? Thelema can be roughly translated as will, or purpose, and the Abbey of Thelema appears to find its origins in the 16th century satire by Renaissance writer François Rabelais. Called Gargantua and Pantagruel, the Abbey of Thelema is a utopia in which the inhabitants follow not the law, but their own desires, the only rule being, do what thou wilt. This phrase became central to Thelema and Crowley's life, and he expanded on this with the central tenets of Thelema. 1. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, meaning that adherents of Thelema should seek out and follow their true path, find or determine their true will. 2. Love is the law, love under will. The nature of the law of Thelema is love, but love itself is subsidiary to finding and manifesting one's authentic purpose or mission. 3. Every man and woman is a star, which is to say that in the 20th century era vulgaris cosmology, it is implied by metaphor that persons doing their wills are like stars in the universe, occupying a time and position in space, yet distinctly individual, and having an independent nature, largely without undue conflict with other stars. The practice of Thelema now varies with each individual, but at the time of its conception, Crowley appeared to have used a frequent set of practices such as initiation, various magical rites and ceremonies, invocations, and even sex magic. Crowley pulled from strands of both Western occultism and Eastern practices such as yoga and meditation. Like many ceremonial magicians of his time, he was fond of rituals designed to put one in touch with their holy guardian angel, itself a concept handed down through various esoteric traditions, which appears to originate in the 15th century magical text, the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin, the Mage. This is attributed to an author called Abraham of Worms. This text was later translated by MacGregor Mathers of the Golden Dawn. It's a ritual intended to put one in touch with their, quote, holy guardian angel, and is interpreted at points by Crowley to be the means through which to reach and converse with the divine self, something hinted at in the line, every man and woman is a star, spoken by Nuit at the start of the Book of the Law. At various points, Crowley identifies the messenger of Horus, Aiwas, as his personal guardian angel, though later commentators note that he initially thought the Book of the Law a result of his own subconscious, an idea he later denounced in favour of the external messenger interpretation. Looking for somewhere to practice his burgeoning religion, Crowley obtained the Abbey of Thelema, a building in Cefalù, Sicily, in 1920. It was here he espoused his new religious paradigm, that of the Aeon of Horus. It quickly grew as a magical retreat and eventually a school of occultism, attracting various writers, artists, and even a few famous actors to its doors over the next few years. Crowley described it as heavenly, a place where he could practice his beliefs in clement weather and espouse his teaching whilst wearing ceremonial robes. He would pray to the Egyptian god Ra daily, in addition to undertaking magical ritual designed to aid in the magician's ascent of consciousness. Participants were encouraged to live by the maxim, do what thou wilt, although there were complaints from some quarters about actions Crowley would require participants to undertake, such as same-sex magical acts. It's also reported that children at the Abbey were witness to some of the sex rites performed there. This is, I expect, a little much for even the broadest libertarian in most eras, and Crowley's reputation for the disregard of common standards of behaviour was somewhat infamous by this point. Compounding these problematic behaviours were the conditions at the Abbey. It turns out, do what thou wilt isn't great for housekeeping, and conditions soon became highly unsanitary, leading to the deaths of a member and one of Crowley's own children. But the final nail in the coffin for the Abbey came in 1923, when upon hearing of the goings-on at the Abbey, the fascist government of Mussolini demanded that Crowley leave the country. Whilst that was the end of the Thelema Abbey, Crowley would continue its practice and even pen sequels to the Book of the Law, And whilst dabbling in various literary ventures and travel was still dear to Crowley, magic always remained a part of his world. Crowley lived a life with few compromises, rubbing shoulders with luminaries of his time and even acting as a double agent for the Allied powers during the war, or so it's told. He died on the 1st of December 1947 from complications of chronic bronchitis and pleurisy. But his work with Thelema lives on in books, organisations, websites, and in the influence it had on countless organisations and individuals. Crowley was, to say the least, a divisive figure, and I most certainly can't condone most of his behaviours, but his legacy remains one of fearless experimentation, right or wrong, and as a self-described prophet of the Aeon of Horus, his practices are certainly a fascinating, if somewhat unorthodox account of early Western interpretations of ancient Egyptian religion. Thelema remains one of the most unique examples of loosely called Egyptomania, or if you will, Egyptian reception to this day, and I suspect you'd have to go pretty far to top it. I hope that you've enjoyed this brief exploration of the world of Thelema and the Book of the Law. I would encourage you to go out and find the book or read it online. I'm sure you can find most of it on there. It's a really interesting work, and like I say, a fascinating insight into the mind of Crowley, and perhaps somewhat limited understanding of Egyptian archaeology and Egyptian religion and mythology at the time. This, of course, was compounded by the classical educations of most writers of the period. And that's all we have time for this week. Thank you for joining me once again. I've been Dr. Paul Harrison. Let me know how you feel about this particular format, and I'll see about creating more in the future. And once again, thanks for listening.